Okay, so one of the things that I'd like to start doing on here is I'd like to start talking about some theory concepts in kind of a live setting where they're not highly edited, they're not pre-recorded, where I come in here and I go over some concepts that often confuse students. And what I wanted to talk about today are the basic vocal ranges that you should use if you're writing four-part harmony and the basic idea behind authentic cadences. So I'm actually going to share my screen with you, and I'm going to show you something that I've been working on. If you were a student of mine over at UNLV, you're familiar with this. It's this chord progression sheet. And so this chord progression sheet is actually several pages, and it's essentially every chord progression and the voicings along with tips on how you can actually create these chord progressions. So it's something that I give to my students because sometimes in the textbook, there's just a little bit too much information. And I believe that by creating these paradigms, these simple instructional templates where you have the information on how to create a chord progression without actually going into a lot of the context surrounding why you'd use them. I find it's really useful for them to figure out how to write these chord progressions a little bit more effectively, and it just helps with retention. So the first thing that you should know when you're writing your chord progressions, you'll notice you've got four voices: soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. And there are suggested ranges. And that's exactly what these are. These are suggested ranges. It doesn't mean that if you're a soprano, you can only sing from a C4 up to a G5. But it does mean that if you're writing chorale harmony, if you're writing these chord progression exercises, this would be the range that you'd want to use. And one thing that's not talked about too much is, we often do these exercises where we say, okay, write an authentic cadence and follow these rules, but we don't often talk about how to create the best sound from your chord progressions. And so if you want the sound to blend, choose the middle, maybe the fifth from about an A, actually maybe a fourth, only up to a D here. That would be sort of the best range in the soprano. For the alto, maybe a C up to an F or a G. You want to use similar ranges so that the chord progression actually sounds balanced. Because what happens if you use the highest range of the soprano up here on this G, and then you kind of use the middle range of the alto, the soprano is going to have a different timbre. I'm not going to say it's going to sound more stretched, but it's going to definitely have that higher tessitura that we'd have in the soprano range. And that's going to change the color of the soprano in relation to the alto. So if you keep the alto kind of in the middle range, then and you keep the soprano in the middle range, then they're both going to be in a comfortable part of their range, and it's going to generally be a better sound. Now, of course, we're talking about chorale writing here. I just have to emphasize this again. I am not talking about writing for individual singers. If you have soprano, mezzo soprano, contralto, all these different voice classifications we have, that's a whole nother subject that I'm not getting into right now. What we're talking about right now is chorale writing using best practices in a way. So the idea behind this is if I tell you that if you write in the middle of these ranges whenever you can, and you try and keep the ranges consistent, use the middle of the soprano range, the middle of the alto, the middle of the tenor, and the middle of the bass, then you're going to create a consistent sound. If you use the high end of the soprano, the low end of the alto, the high end of the tenor, and then maybe the middle range of the bass, you're not going to have as consistent of a sound. And what we're trying to do is create consistency in the sound. We're trying to first show you how to create chord progressions that sound balanced and smooth. Once you understand how to do that, then from an orchestration standpoint, you can start changing things. So let's say you do want the soprano line to stand out. You could use the higher range and use the middle range of the alto, tenor, and bass. And that'll create a nice smooth texture in the alto, tenor, and bass while the soprano truly gets the solo. Let's say you want the alto to stand out. Use the higher range of the alto or even the lower range. It'll stand out because the texture is going to be a little bit different. So these are some concepts that we don't usually talk about when introducing students to chord progressions, but I think they're really important because they really help you to understand what these voice registers actually mean for you as a composer, as a performer, as a musician, as a conductor. I mean, if you're analyzing a score and you see the sopranos written really high, that tells you something. It tells you one of two things, really. The composer either doesn't know what they're doing, or the composer really wants that soprano line to stand out, right? So these are kind of traditional vocal ranges, the C4 to G5. That's generally where you'll write the top line. So in these chord progressions, it's always going to be the top line here. These are all soprano lines. And you'll notice they all fit within the range of C4 to G5. For the alto, we've got a G3 to a D5. You'll notice the alto also, the second line here in the treble clef. It's always that second line from the top. The other thing you should notice, these stems are going up, right? I didn't have the G with a stem going down, because when we write for soprano, alto, tenor, bass, we're typically writing treble and bass clef, and we want to clearly indicate what the voices are. So one way to do that, especially in part writing, is you have the stems go up for the soprano and the tenor, stems go down for the alto and the bass. That way you can clearly see, okay, this is part of the soprano line, this is part of the alto. Because there could be some situations where you have a voice crossing or a voice overlapping. And then you'd clearly want to indicate who is singing what voice. And so in that case, if you had a voice crossing right here, let's say the G was in the soprano and the B was in the alto, which you generally wouldn't want to do, the alto would have a line coming down and, the soprano, the alto would have a line coming down and the soprano would have a line coming up. So the direction of the lines matters. This is why we also tend to write our chord progressions when we're doing part writing exercises. We tend to write them with half notes so that we can indicate the stems. A mistake I see a lot of students do is they will use whole notes, and you don't want to use whole notes. You don't want to do that. Whole notes don't indicate clearly what the voices are. And since we're not concerned with rhythm, we're not concerned with motivic development, we're not doing any of that. In fact, most music has been removed from the equation when you're doing things like this, when you're doing part writing, because these are just paradigms. They're meant to teach you the basic structure of music. This is a skeleton. This 5/1 progression here is a cadence. If you play it, which you should on the piano, even if you're slow, just pick out each note and hear this chord progression, hear each one of these. But if you play it, it's going to sound finalized, especially if you've already established this tonic sense in your mind. So if you start with a 1 chord, then you go to a 5 and a 1, it'll feel like a return home. And then what composers can do with that is they can modify that, they can ornament it, they can do all kinds of interesting things to make these cadences more interesting. But this is just a skeleton. This is just a framework that everything else can be built on. Now, talking about composition a little bit, I don't necessarily think that you should be writing your music thinking, okay, I need a 5/1 cadence here. You don't need to do that. Oftentimes, what happens, the more you listen to the music and the more that you practice these exercises where you're doing part writing or counterpoint, just practicing theory in general and studying actual musical scores of actual music, you get into your head this sort of sense of logic, okay? So music theory, it's not a law that we use to create music. It's a theory. And I firmly believe that when you study music theory, what's actually happening, if you're a composer, it doesn't matter if you're studying Bach or if you're studying Beethoven or Mahler, Stravinsky, Schoenberg, it doesn't matter who you're studying. Anytime you understand a theory behind a composition, what ends up happening is you get a better understanding of the logic of music. So there's this concept, which I've heard other composers state. Well, they'll say something like, well, why study Bach? Bach was not in this century. Bach is, from a different time. So if you study Bach, you're going to write like Bach. I don't believe that at all. I firmly believe that if you study Bach and you understand the principles of composition that Bach employed, then you understand a logic, and it adds to your sort of understanding of composition in general. And then that can apply to your more modern composition, whatever style you're writing. This is why when I teach composers, I don't care what style they have. I don't care if they're jazz composers, if they're film composers. I mean, I have composers that write for video games. I have a composer who is now writing for Xbox, and I have composers that are just all over the place, but they've all learned from the lessons. And the reason they learn is because I do not focus on, you need to write in this style. You need to properly resolve your seventh chord. You need to properly resolve your leading tones. You need to understand these concepts. The way I teach is by looking at the material that they have presented to me, using the logic that I've learned from studying theory for so many years, and applying that logic to their compositions. Because every composition ends up having sort of its own rules that you need to follow as a composer. And when you initially write out a composition, you don't worry about that. You just, this is my opinion, you just sit there and you compose. You write a melody if that's all you can come up with. And then I'll show you how to extract harmony from that melody. And then I'll show you how to develop that melody and how to develop that harmony and how to develop the piece into something that's more than 8 measures long. Because the information for every new piece changes. I was talking to one of my students. He was a vocalist at the Manhattan School of Music, and now he's in a doctoral program. And he brought me a piece a couple of weeks ago, and it had these quick moving running lines. And then he brought me another piece which had the same thing. And he said, "Now I'm going to remove this because I know you said don't do that." But I actually told him, in this piece it works. You can do that in this piece. And the point of telling you this story is that when you are composing, when you are writing music, the music itself dictates the choices you can make. And it's not like you only have 1 or 2 choices. I don't believe that. But there are a certain number of choices that make sense based on what you've done so far. And you as a composer get to make those choices. But it's not completely, I don't believe it's completely up to the composer. I think that you can create a composition that is somewhat manufactured, where you go through and you can apply theory and you can be very intellectual about it. And you can force your ideas on a composition and it might sound okay. But I believe that there is a better way to write it. And that way is by looking at the material that's present in the composition currently and finding a way to bring it out, to develop it. And so that little tangent there is kind of a long way of saying these chord progressions are not necessarily the rule for how you end a phrase. And it's one of the things I usually have to break down with new composers, is because they'll come in, and I'm finding it more and more lately. And I think maybe it has to do with the fact there's just so much information on music theory available now. I mean, here's another tangent. When I went to school, there wasn't really anything on the internet. I had to go to the library and find books and do a lot of research that way. And still, it wasn't the kind of education where you could just go onto YouTube, play a video, and learn some concepts about music theory. Now, music theory has been explained in so many different ways, and it's so easily accessible that I think the students that are coming into composition lessons, they have a greater understanding of theory to begin with. Even if it's still a relatively low level of understanding, they still have a greater understanding than most of the kids when I went to school. And so what I'm finding is that they're using it and they're relying on it, and they are not trusting the fact that they can intuit their melody. A lot of composers used to say, I don't know where my melody comes from. They'd say it comes from their muse or God or some higher power, right? And to an extent, there's some logic to that. If you look behind what they're actually saying, they're saying that they don't really know how they create their melodies, but surely they know how they develop their pieces. There's a craft, there's a logic, and that logic comes from learning theory and then seeing how that theory is employed in Bach and Mozart. So if you learn counterpoint, 16th century counterpoint, that absolutely relates to the music that's being played today. I don't care if it's Stravinsky. I don't care if it's Schoenberg. There are underlying principles, sort of secrets of composition, that are embedded within these studies that you can then use to enhance your own compositions and your own style. So you won't sound like Bach. You're not going to sound like any other composer unless you intentionally try to sound like them. And that's what I usually have to try and push students away from. because they'll come in and they'll have this idea of music theory, right? They'll have this idea of what it should be and that I have to use it, otherwise my composition isn't good enough. And the truth is, you have to create your own music theory for each new composition. If you're really devoted to kind of developing your craft and your style. And over time, what happens is as you're looking at your compositions, you start to see things that you do over and over again. And then you get to decide, do I like this? Is this part of my style? Or is this something that I don't want to keep rehashing and doing over and over again? So, you know, when I teach composition, I'm always trying to get composers to just compose with their own style, their own way of doing things. But I think that theory is an important aspect of composition, and it's not enough to sit there and simply write out chord progressions. I mean, if I look at this first chord progressions, there's lots of videos on here where I show you how to actually write these. So I'm not really going to do that right now. You can look at some of the other construction videos I have in my Western Music Theory playlist. Often the construction videos, you know, you can watch those for free. So I'm not going to go over that here and right now. But here, you know, if we're writing a chord progression, we can say, oh, here's a leading tone. It's resolving up. Okay, there's my tendency tone. I've got a 5-1 progression, which means I need scale degree 5 in the bass and scale degree 1. All right, then I want to move in the shortest possible motion for the other voices. Okay, if you do that, you will create a smooth chord progression. The smoothest chord progression that we currently know how to create, right? But let's say you do something different. You want to have this G skip down to the E. And you want to have this D skip down to a G. Well, now you have the dreaded parallel fifths, and you have a skip in one of the voices, which you actually have here in the contrapuntal one as well. And so now what this does is it makes the chord progression feel less stable. It makes it feel uncertain in a way. It brings out the bass voices because that parallel fifth motion is so strong. So now there's an imbalance in the chord progression. Those fifths in the bass become really powerful. So we would say don't do that. But we say don't do that because we are trying to help you write the smoothest chord progressions possible. We're trying to teach you the way that it was done for hundreds of years, right? And then once you understand how to do that, you can start to play around with other possibilities, and your ear will be tuned in such a way and refined in such a way that now you can hear that fifth stand out. You can hear how a skip in the inner line places an extra emphasis on the note that comes after the skip. So going from a G down to an E, that E would be emphasized. And you can say, well, compositionally, actually, I want that. I want this to be unexpected. I want this to stand out. I want those basses to come out because they're about to become a solo line. So there are reasons for using parallel fifths. It's just that we tell you not to do it because we're trying to teach you how to create smooth chord progressions. That's the goal. And so the other concept here is the perfect, authentic, and imperfect. Why would scale degree 1 have to be in the soprano for the 1 chord? In order for it to be perfect, you have to have scale degree 1 in the soprano, and then you should have stepwise motion leading into that. So that could either be a B up to a C or a D down to a C. But in the perfect, authentic cadence, typically it is a B moving up to the C because the leading tone has to resolve. And so if we had a D coming down to C here, that would mean we'd have to have a B here, and the leading tone has to go up. You'd end up creating issues with voice leading. So typically with the perfect authentic cadence, it's going to be scale degree 7 to 1, but it's possible to have 2 to 1. There are ways to do it. So the idea here is that when scale degree 1's in the soprano, it resonates with the C in the bass. It's an octave. Now, if you know anything about the overtone series, another video on here, you can watch me talk about the overtone series and actually play it for you. You will see that this C resonates because the first partial in the overtone series is an octave. The next one is a fifth. So that G will resonate pretty well too. But if you put that C in the soprano, it creates this strong grounding with the 1 chord, and it feels more stable, more complete. If you do something like this, where it becomes imperfect, right? Now we have a fifth in soprano, which actually wouldn't be done in the classical period. And here's a 3 in the soprano, which would be done in the classical period. but these would both be considered imperfect authentic cadences. And so what's happening here is we have this strong foundation and it's not being reinforced in the soprano. So it's weakened because it doesn't have the same resonance that this one does. And so a lot of things that we do in music, a lot of things that occur from a theoretical standpoint, occur because they were decisions that either resonated or didn't with the overtone series. And by didn't, I really mean resonated less, right? And so that's really why we have this perfect and imperfect authentic cadence. You want to end a piece in the traditional sense, you'd use a perfect authentic. You want to make it feel like it's not quite done, it has to go on, use an imperfect authentic. You want to make it feel kind of somewhere in between where you get the resonance of that perfect authentic, but it feels incomplete because of the inversion in the bass. You have a contrapuntal and perfect authentic cadence. So these are just some of the concepts that we teach in composition lessons, hopefully. And we try and, at least I try and teach these theory concepts in a way where it's not overly dogmatic, where I don't come in and I say, this is a law, this is a way, this is the only way to do it. Because the fact of the matter is what this teaches you, if you do this correctly, if you write out all these chord progressions in different voicings, and you write them out in every key, and as you're writing them out in each key, you're also going to the piano and you're playing them. And then after you play them, you try and imagine them in whatever clarity you can. You try and remember the sound of the chord progression you just played. That 5 going to 1. You hear it in your mind. Maybe you only hear the top voice and the bottom voice, and there's some fuzziness in the middle. That's fine. The point is you're trying to audiate these and play them on the piano. And then you do that in every key. Then what you've done for yourself is you have started to teach yourself a concept. You started to incorporate a concept that will now be part of your arsenal when you compose music. And it won't mean that at the end of a phrase, all of a sudden, because you've written these out in every key, you're going to start using those in your composition. And you're just going to naturally write perfect 5/1 cadences. Some people do that. They do it naturally. But it's not the goal. The goal is for you to really just take your time. Spend 2 weeks on these authentic cadences, maybe even a month. Learn to play them, learn to hear them, learn to internalize them. And then what will happen is it will expand sort of your consciousness on what's possible in music. It will make you a better composer. It won't necessarily change your style, but it will improve your style. You won't start writing like Bach. You won't start writing like Beethoven. You won't start writing like Mozart. You'll start writing more like yourself, but you'll have more capability to do so. And so, I mean, this was kind of my introduction to vocal ranges and authentic cadences. But if you wanted to start working on these on your own, what I would recommend is you start with the perfect authentic cadence. Write it out in every different key. These voicings don't matter. I talk about this in other videos, but the B doesn't, well, in this case, the B does have to go to C, but the G doesn't have to be here. You could put it in the tenor. You can move these voicings around, and that's why I've shown you there's different voicings. So here, both of these have a B going up to a C. But this one, the alto has a G, and this one, the alto has D to E, and the G has been moved down to the tenor here. The D and E is in the tenor here. So you can move the voices around. The voicing doesn't matter. It only matters when you write a perfect authentic cadence that you have scale degree 7 going to 1, like I have here. For the imperfect, any voicing could be done. You could have the B in the soprano, except that would make it perfect authentic unless you had an inversion here, like what you have here. You'd have to have that inversion. And actually, this one wouldn't work either, because if you have this B in the soprano, then all of a sudden you have parallel octaves. But the other voices, other than the leading tone, could be moved around. So what I would recommend, if you're interested in just kind of developing your logic of music, is start with these chord progressions. Start with the authentic ones. Become very familiar with them. But just enjoy them. Enjoy the process. And do it a couple days a week. It doesn't have to be every day. But when you do it, spend 45 minutes to an hour. Write these out by hand. Don't use a computer program. Make that connection when you write them out by hand. And when you start writing each new key, play your starting pitch on the piano so that as you're writing them on the paper, you'll start to, and it won't maybe start at first, but you'll start to actually hear the notes as you're writing them. And that's when you're really starting to develop this skill. So I think I'm going to leave it at that for today. But one of the things I'm actually going to start doing very soon over the summer is for students that are trying to enter music programs. What I found over my almost a decade teaching in the university, I found that there is a severe lack of knowledge about music theory. Often kids, if they know music theory, they just know their major and minor scales, which is important. They know their key signatures, but they're not very quick at them. And so I'm creating a course that goes over kind of concepts in music theory. It's to help you pass those entrance exams and to also help you just learn music theory so that you are able to actually participate in your courses with whatever theory instructor you end up studying with. And the idea here is there's certain concepts, right? There's certain methods of analyzing music. So if you go, just as a quick example, if you go step by step and you analyze every chord in a piece, what you've done is not actually analyze the piece, you've labeled the chords in the piece. So maybe you have a 1-6-4 chord going to a 5 as an example. That's clearly a 1-6-4 chord. It's clearly going to a 5, but you haven't analyzed it if you've done that because you haven't found that 1-6-4 to 5 is actually part of a set called a cadential 6-4. And what it does is it creates this dominant function. It acts like a 5 chord. That 1-6-4 we don't actually hear as a 1-6-4, we hear it as a 5. So then you label it a different way. You label it as a cadential 6-4, not as 1-6-4 to 5. And this is something that is missing in a lot of students' understanding, because they will take theory and they'll never really understand that we don't care so much about the labeling, we care about the functioning of chords. A tonic chord could be a 1 chord. A tonic chord, a substitute, could be a 6 chord. They're both actually serving as tonic function. A 1-6 chord is sort of a weaker tonic chord. It's also serving as tonic function. And these are things that we don't really talk about in music theory, that we don't express until much later on. So I'm going to offer this crash course. It will really serve 2 purposes. One, for high school students that are ready to start a program in music that want to get ahead. And 2, to give you sort of a framework for understanding music theory. So when you do get into college, you can do better in your actual courses. Because music theory, I just see it over and over again. It's one of those things that hold students back. They're great musicians. They can play their instrument. They're performing all over town. They're doing great things. They're starting businesses, but they have trouble getting the degree because they don't have the music theory knowledge. It's lacking. And then they don't do well in their programs. They do great in private lessons, ensembles, and even music history in a lot of cases. But when it comes to theory, they're getting C's or they're getting D's. And it's happening because they were just not introduced to theory in the right way. And so that's something that I want to try and fix a little bit. So if that's something you're interested in, post a little note in the comments saying, hey, I'm interested in that and I can get you additional information on it. I'm going to be officially releasing this information in about a week. And for now, I plan on having it every year, just over the summer. So it's a one-time only thing. But if it ends up being something that people need in the middle of the year, I'll do that. I'm also going to consider doing something for graduate students too. And so at this point, what'll happen is I'm probably going to combine the two. I'm going to teach the undergraduate information, and then I might provide some tips for the future for graduate school if you're going to start applying to those schools. So let me know if that's something you're interested in, and thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.